All right, so let's the among the issues raised by coronavirus, many of a more severe type. Among the less severe, although very, very significant, but not a life or death nature, are some of the financial and monetary ramifications that come about. I'll just share the screen now so we can look at the handout. And there's a whole host of different issues that come up. Just to give a few quick examples with using news stories. One, babysitters. People who have babysitters or domestic workers or home help generally they've not been continued working in homes for reasons of safety and health. So, what do you do about your babysitter? Well, number one, there's a question of, if the babysitter is not coming in, practically how to deal with it. For our purposes, there's the Halakhic question. So, what do you do in terms of paying the babysitter for the time that they're not there? Another scenario that comes up is various places where you either rent a space or you have a program. There was this fraudulent forged announcement from the CDC that was going around about a month ago. It's come to our attention that the Jewish holiday of Passover has many people staying at programs. We are recommending that all such programs be canceled. Now, in the end, as far as I can tell, just about all Pesach programs in the United States were canceled, but that was not sent by the CDC. But the point is, for someone who signs up for a Pesach program or to rent a space for a simcha of some sort, or whatever the case may be, or even renting a space for their business, and then the business closes, what do you do about that? You had an agreement in place beforehand, but it's no longer relevant, it's sort of moot, and how do you deal with that on a halachic basis? And then finally, a lot of educational programs. Schools, obviously schools have been canceled for a while now. Play groups, which we're gonna see, there's been a fair amount of literature about the last month or two, play groups in particular. And now summer camps programs, some summer camps are starting to cancel. So what happens there? What if you paid a deposit? Do you get your deposit back? What if you even paid tuition for a month of play group? And then you don't end up, the child doesn't end up attending. Do you get that back? These are all questions that need to be dealt with. And obviously it's not the same as some of the topics we discussed previously, which are literal life and death topics. But these can also be very severe and very, very challenging for people. And we're only going to see as time goes on the full extent of the financial fallout from coronavirus, and these are important issues as well. But I think my sense is because they're less immediately of such a severe level, there's a bit less literature right now on the financial issues. There is some, but we're going to be drawing heavily from earlier materials, both classical halakhic sources and written tshuvos and articles from previous similar scenarios or parallel scenarios, not exactly similar, with a few treatments of how this plays itself out today. So there's really two different levels at which we could discuss this. There's a general question of if someone pulls out of a business deal, how do you deal with that? Or if someone was hired to be a teacher and then you no longer need their services, how does one work out those details? That's one question, but the question that's more directly relevant here, that's sort of built on top of that, is a scenario when there's some widespread crisis, what's called a makas medina. There's some sort of attack or problem that's region-wide or nation-wide. And the halacha has different categories in these cases, and the question is how that would apply in our scenarios as well. So source number one here, the Gemara, the Mishnah, talks about if someone receives a field from their friend, they're sort of renting a field, a chocher. So you pay money to be able to work a field, and you keep the results. You keep what you grow. Im makas medinahi minake lo min chikuro. If it's a global issue, if the whole region is flooded, then you can decrease. You don't need to pay your full rental, for the time that it's not usable, you don't need to pay. Im eino makas medina, but if it's local, if just this field in particular got flooded, you don't decrease your payment. You still need to pay for that month. What's the reason for that? Rashi explains, he can say to him, it's your fault. You're the only one, you who are using the field this month are the only one for whom the field flooded. Why did that happen? It must be you have bad mazel. Now, there's two ways of understanding this. You can understand this in a literal and I guess Kabbalistic or a magical type sense that there's you actually have mazel that affects you, etc. There's a whole discussion in the Gemara on Shabbos whether we accept this idea that there's mazel affecting the Jews. So that's one way of understanding it. Is literally referring to mazel. It's your bad luck in some in some sense. There's mazalos, the constellations that affect your life. Alternatively, you could just say it's under, in a more practical sense, it's under your control. It's sort of bad luck for you. Just like when we say bad luck nowadays, we don't always mean that there's a concept of luck. It just means it fell out bad for you, and it's it's on you. It's not on everyone. And this gets paskin. This gets ruled in the Shulchan Aruch, where he writes Hachocher Amakabel Sadam Mechaveru Hu Beis Hashlachim Beis Ilan Yavesh Hamayan Beis Hashlachim Lo Pasag Anar Gadol. The field, the water dries up, and you can't water your field. If you can get water from elsewhere, not the usual way, then you don't get decreased. So there's an exception here that if there's another way of doing it, even in the normal case where it's not a makas medina, you don't have the normal ability to water your field. If there's a way of doing it through difficulty, you're expected to do that. If not, and it's really totally worthless, then there may be an exception there. But for our purposes, the makas medina, if it's a pandemic, if there's some global issue affecting this business, the whole river dries up, no one has water, you don't need you can decrease from your rental cost of the field. And the Ramah here expands on this more globally. If it's a global issue where the whole region is affected, you don't need to pay your rent. This applies in all similar scenarios. If your item is completely lost, if you have no use for it, and it's makas medina, it's a global issue, so you don't need to pay your rental. So just like renting a field, you don't need to pay if it's not usable due to some global issue. If you rent anything else, if you rent a wedding hall or whatever else, or a business suite, it would be the same. And he says, if it's now difficult for you to use your field, but not impossible, if you can find some trick, some way of watering the field anyway, then you don't get off the hook. Fine, and then he talks about whether there's a difference between going forward and looking backwards, whether the expectation is you need to pull out if you don't want to use it anymore. The logic here, some have raised the question what exactly the logic is. So the Taz explains it as follows, that whenever there's a makas medina, global issue, the Baal Bayis, the owner of the field, not the one who's using it. The one who owns it loses. Why? We now assume that it's not the person who's immediately using it whose bad luck it is. It's the bad luck of the owner because it's a global issue. So it's sort of seen as more globally on the general owner rather than on the person who's there right now. And that's at least part of the logic that the Taz gives. So that's the classic case of makas medina, where there's a global issue. Now that applies in two different types of scenarios here, which will be category of renting, just like renting a field here, or renting renting an office or renting a space, and it'll also apply in terms of employment, hiring, right? Because in Hebrew it's actually the same term, schiras, right? You rent a field, you rent a person's labor. You hire a person's labor. That's the same term in Hebrew. It's the same concept, right? You pay money for use of capital, human capital or otherwise. So in some of the early sources, or the classical sources about this issue in terms of renting, so the Shulchan Aruch writes, we're not going to read through the whole piece, but basically if you rent someone a specific house, you can't knock it down. You have to actually rent it to them. You can't knock it down before they start using it. The if the house itself falls down, you rent the person this particular apartment, and then it breaks. It literally disintegrates. So if you said I'm renting you this apartment, as opposed to I'll rent you an apartment in the building, and that's the agreement, or a dorm room. If you say this particular apartment, then you don't need to build it again, because it's this person's bad luck that the building fell down. And however, the Ramah here says, in a scenario of nisraf habayis, dino kinafal, if the house burns down, that's the same as if it fell down. There's no difference there. But nisraf kol ha'ir, if the whole city burns down, which is the equivalent of Makas Medina. It's a global issue. The whole city burns down. Havi Makas Medina menakelo min schiruso mashlo darbo. Then you don't need to pay for the rent for that month that the house was now burned down. And we don't say mazlach garm, but the same exact idea here, right? You're renting an apartment. If if the apartment is uninhabitable, it's your loss. It's sort of on you. It's your bad luck. But if the whole region is uninhabitable, if all the house is burned down, then it's the loss of the owner. So that's a major difference between Makas Medina, a global issue, and a normal scenario in terms of who has to take the loss. Now that's the Ramah's position. This is not globally agreed upon. So the Ravan, one of the Rishonim Ashkenaz, says, Hachi dinahu, the yafsid hasocher hachetzi. The renter should lose half. Even in a scenario, in one of those scenarios, the renter should only lose half. The hasam haisa kol maka ala sadeh shel machgir, shari nishtafa ruba de baga, v'lo haisa maka ala chocher. Avahaki glememer gzeres hamaka al shnehem haisa, ala batim lios bedudim, ala nashim lios golim. His logic goes back to this idea of whose bad luck it is. So if I'm just renting a particular field or apartment, and that field or apartment is affected, so then we can say it's my bad luck, it's my responsibility, this is my particular area. But if it's a scenario where the whole region is affected, then really everyone loses. The people renting lose, the people who are using the apartments lose, the people who own the apartments lose, everyone loses out, so it's equal. So you should split the loss between the person renting the field and the person renting out the field. English, unfortunately, English doesn't have great, standard English doesn't have great terms for renting versus renting out. But the socher and the maskir each split the loss. That's the Ravan. So it's not that the socher doesn't need to pay anything. No, you need to pay half. The Machne Ephraim goes even in a different direction. He first cites the Ravan and discusses that, but he quotes a Yerushalmi, and he says a scenario here, afilu hecha dahavi makas medina, even in a scenario of makas medina, the kaimelan dahavi pseida de maskir, mikol makom im hiktim lo haschar, ein tzarach lachziro, daha nagav nara havi makas medina. He says it's true in a normal case where there's makas medina, the renter, the person who owns the field is the one who loses out. However, if the person using the field paid him already, if he paid up front at the beginning of the month, then he loses out. Then the money ends up he doesn't get his money back. The person who wanted to use the field, who paid for use of the field, if you paid in advance, you don't get your money back. He says a Halakhic Rav Nachman, we paskin like this, and I think the logic seems relatively well. At least one way of rendering the logic is, so he explains it in the last line here. Since you paid the money up front, it becomes yours immediately. Even though usually we say that that a rental agreement you pay at the end, and you sort of buy it at the end of the month. So since you pay the money up front, it sort of becomes your field. The person who's using the field becomes their field, and then when there's a loss, it's totally their loss. So the Machne Ephraim. So we have so far 3 views. The Ramah says if you're using the field and there's Makas Medina, there's a global issue, you're totally exempt. The Ravan says you split it, and the Machne Ephraim says that it depends whether you paid in advance or not. And there's a question about how we apply that nowadays, now that the standard practice is to pay rent in advance, but we'll leave that on the side for now. If we look at the Shach, so he writes, to Pasak that he quotes the Marami Tiktin. He says Pasak in our scenario that Tzarech Hasocher L'Shalim Lo, that you actually need to pay the rent in this case, where you rent the area, and then there's Shinui Avir. This is a phrase we see a lot. There's a change in the air, which I think means there's a disease, which they attributed to bad air. So it's very similar to our scenario actually, and which of course actually does relate to air, for things in the air, and that's why people needed to run away. So you still need to pay in that case. And the Shach himself disagrees. And similarly, the Taz also follows the straightforward reading of the Ramah. A scenario where everyone needs to run away. The owner of the field is the one who loses out. So we have a couple of dissenting views, but the main views, the Ramah, the Shach, and the Taz, the most classical poskim, say that you're exempted from paying the rent, whereas there's a couple of minority positions one from Arisha, one from the Ravan, implying that you split it, one from the Machane Ephraim, that it depends whether you paid or not, and one from the Ma'aram Mitiktin that you always pay. So there's the full range of views. What about practically? So this is a tshuva from Rav Asher Weiss and Minchas Asher, not a recent one, it's published already, based on previous issues. Israel, there's a fair amount of literature on Makas Medina in cases where there's where areas, people don't rent in areas due to wars or terrorism. So he wrote about that issue. He says, the great pillars of halacha, the Taz Nashach, Dever, who al balabais, since they say that the owner loses out, meaning the person who is using the field doesn't need to pay. And even though it goes into more details in Rami Rittenberg's case, which we actually haven't looked at yet, he says, if you run away for war, that's close enough to our case, to a disease, and definitely in our scenario today, a disease would be exactly the same. Definitely, if you haven't paid your rent yet, you can say, well, I am following the Taz and the Shach, and I don't need to pay rent. And what if you paid the rent already? Jump down to the bottom here. What if you paid your rent for that month and then you had to vacate because of, in his case, terror, or in our case, disease? You still need to pay back the money. So this is going against multiple views, going against even the view that we saw of the Machane Ephraim, that if you paid up front, you're sort of okay with paying, you've given up your right to keep the money. It's going against that view. He's saying we rule against that, like the Shach and the Taz, and you can collect your money back. And it's also going against the principle in halacha we often apply, known as kimli. Kimli, which means I literally I establish it, or I hold like this position. Meaning, if there's a dispute with various positions, sometimes one can say, okay, this is not the standard position, it's a minority position, but I happen to believe in this position, and it helps me out because I don't need to pay. And that's application that can be applied on the basis of muhsak. If you're holding on to the money, in some cases you can choose which halachic opinion you're going to rely on. As we know, possession is 9/10 of the law, or hamotzi mechaver olav haraya, and there's room to rely on a minority position sometimes. Here, Rav Asher Weiss says you can't do that. Not only do we not rule like the position that it depends who has the money, you even can collect from the person, collect your money back from the person who is leasing you the apartment. And the reason why he says this is because he thinks there's a clear psak, there's a clear ruling because of who's on the position that you're exempted from paying. The Shach and the Taz, major central poskim, that we rule like that to the exclusion of the other opinion. You can collect your money back. On the other hand, the Emek HaMishpat of Yaakov Cohen, again a contemporary posek, he has an article where he talks about a similar issue relating to Tzfat, when there was some fighting in the north, a war in the north, and he writes, without going into detail, if you paid rent already, you can't force the person who rented you the apartment to pay back. He can say, I rely on the Machane Ephraim, that it depends on whether you paid already or not. That's the opinion I'm following. And why do we care what he says? Because he's the muhsak. He's holding on to the money, so he has some room to choose what position he can rely on. And he says, okay, fine, it's against all these other positions. So we should definitely give back at least some of the money, because you have those other opinions, and definitely in terms of pshara, where you don't rule based on the specific technical halacha, but on ideas of equity and fairness and derachei noam. So it's still better to give back some of the money. I can't force someone to pay back the money. So this is a machlokas, a dispute between the Emek HaMishpat and Rav Asher Weiss in previous cases as to whether you can force someone to pay back rent if the rent was already paid. But they both seem to say if you didn't pay rent, you don't need to pay the rent if for whatever reason you're forced to leave your apartment. But if you already paid, you might not be able to get it back according to the Emek HaMishpat, although according to Rav Asher Weiss you can. And both of them might say that it's proper to do pshara. Actually, Rav Asher Weiss gave a shir about this recently, just the other day. In practice, this is an issue in some areas of Yerushalayim where the rents are, almost all the apartments are rented by Americans. And these Americans came home for Pesach and didn't come back. And why is that relevant? Because for it to be a Makas Medina, it needs to be a scenario where basically the whole area, the whole market is flooded. Literally, the market is flooded. If it's a field, you can't use your field. Or in this case, the market is totally destroyed. No one is renting these apartments right now. There's no demand for apartments in these areas of Yerushalayim because it's always rented by majority Americans and people from elsewhere, and they're all back in America. They're not interested in renting. So what do you do here? You committed to pay rent for these months. You're now back in America. You have no interest in paying your rent because you're not there. What do? So without going into the details, he said that consistent with his position that we saw just now, his position favors the person who's renting the apartment, the person who's living in the apartment, given the Halakhic factors. So he says there's really two options. One option is theoretically, if at some point you say, I no longer want to rent in this apartment, you don't have a contract, you're sort of month to month, you theoretically can stop renting there, and as long as you remove your things, you can end your rental. That's not practical for most people because all their stuff is there and they want to come back in a few months. So in such a scenario, you can't end your rental. You want it to continue later, but you want to get exempted from payment here. So he said, well, there should be some sort of pshara, somewhere around 50-50 at the end of the day. You should be able to get back, get off half of your rent, more or less, based on pshara, also based on the halachic factors there. So that's one recent decision in this area. So much for renting a certain field or apartment. Let's move on now to renting human capital or hiring, also known as schiras in Hebrew, but a different area. So the most important early source after the Gemara in this is the Mordechai from among the Poskim of Ashkenaz. So there was a story where he quotes the Maharam. There was a story where the government didn't allow teaching of Torah. This has happened before in Jewish history, tragically. And he says, and so the government says you can't teach Torah. So what do? You have a Melamed, you have a Rebbe who teaches your kid Torah on a regular basis. If the teacher can't teach, not because he's sick or other scenarios, usually, so just background, usually when there's workers, the general principle, we're going to see it in the Shulchan Aruch in a second, when there are workers who can't work, so in most scenarios, if you can't work, you don't get paid. Unless there's a scenario where the reason why you can't work could have been foreseen by the employer, but not by the employee. In such a case, where the employer is really the employer who's at fault for not being aware of that and not accommodating that scenario, so then the employer has to pay. But if it's a case where either both the employer and the employee knew it was a possibility, or where neither of them knew it was a possibility, usually under normal circumstances, you don't pay the employee. Of course, unless there's some contract or some stipulation, that's different. So what about in this case? The ruler of the city says, no more teaching Torah. It's illegal to teach Torah. He can't teach, you can't learn. Havi makas medina. This is the equivalent of a makas medina. It's as if none of the fields work because the entire field of education is now closed. Hefsed shel ba'al bayis. And just like we saw earlier, that makas medina, you end up saying that instead of the person so here's the interesting thing. So we said before, the person who is using the field, who's paying money to use the field, it sort of wins out in makas medina. He doesn't need to pay the rent. In our case, it's the melamed, the teacher, who's actually getting paid the money, who wins out here. Instead of not receiving his wages because there's a makas medina. In this case, he does receive his wages. So there's a whole question here of whether this is the proper parallel. Some of the sources we have below, which we're not going to read too closely, they say, well, isn't this the opposite? Because it is true that the melamed is the little guy, right? If you're teaching in a school, you have multiple students, and you're sort of the employee, and the person using the field is also, so to speak, the little guy, right? He's someone who owns a bunch of fields, and you're working on some of the fields. But the structure of the arrangement is opposite in the two cases. A chocher, someone who pays to use a field, is paying to use a field, and he ends up benefiting from it being makas medina relative to the normal case. Whereas here, the melamed is getting paid, and he's winning out. So some people have noted this Mordechai seems backwards, but whatever you say about that, the Ramah cites it lahalacha. So let's look at source 13 here. Hasocher es hapol lahashkos hasadeh mizeh hanahar. If someone hires a worker to water the field, and the river stops working, so there's no job to do. If it doesn't usually stop, or if it's, meaning this is unusual, neither side expected it, or if it sometimes stops, but both the employer and the employee knew it could happen, both sides know, say to the poel, the worker doesn't get paid in such a scenario. That's rule number one, right? If either both parties or neither party knows what might happen in a case of onus, where something beyond everyone's control happens, you're exempt in the normal case, meaning the worker doesn't get paid. If this employee does not know the way that the river works, he doesn't know how it works, but the employer knows, then he pays him, although he doesn't pay him full wages, because it's a lot easier to get paid not to work than to get paid to do manual labor. So he gets paid a bit less than his normal wage, known as poel batel. The difference between full payment and payment as someone who doesn't need to do the manual labor, there'll be some differential there. We'll see later on, a standard opinion is you get paid 50%, meaning if you get paid whatever it is, $20 an hour to do manual labor, and the manual labor is unavailable because the employer knew that something might happen, didn't tell you, and then it happened, so he pays you, he'll pay you $10 an hour instead of 20. And the Ramah says here, anytime there's an onus, something that happens to the worker, if either both of them know or both of them don't know, say to the poel, the worker, the employee, doesn't get paid. If the employer is the only one who knows, then he loses out. And now our scenario, if it's a scenario of Makas Medina where it's not just that this one person can't do their job, but no one can do their job, there's no water at all for any of the fields, then Sishin Kafalef, which we saw earlier, and presumably he's following what we saw in the Mordechai, which he also cites part of that below, that means that the employee gets paid in a scenario of Makas Medina. In other words, if we translate it into our case, if you have a daycare or someone who watches a babysitter, so someone who watches someone else's kids. So usually if the person, there's an onus, for some reason there's a snow day, there's no babysitting, so the babysitter wouldn't get paid. If, however, it's not just, well, I guess the snow day depends on how you relate to, right? If, let's say the babysitter gets sick or the kid gets sick, then that's sort of a foreseeable thing, and the babysitter wouldn't get paid under strict Halakhic terms here. And however, if there's Makas Medina, if there's a reason why there's no babysitting happening across the whole region because it's dangerous, because we need to do social distancing, then the Ramah would say, you do pay the babysitter, right? You don't pay the usual full wage because it's, the babysitter now has time to do whatever they usually can't do because they're babysitting, but they still get paid a good chunk of their usual salary. So that's the Ramah's position, following the Mordechai. And it's, again, this is a case where it's not universally agreed upon. The Nesivos here says he's very surprised. This is very surprising, and he makes the point that was mentioned before, that renting, someone using a field, someone paying to use a field, is not comparable to someone being paid to teach. Those are opposite cases. So why would you say that a chocher paying to use a field is like a malamed being paid to teach? It should be the opposite. And why would it help? And he adds, if in a normal case, where let's say the malamed gets sick and can't teach, so the malamed doesn't get paid. So in this case, the whole country gets sick. So why should that be more reason to pay the malamed? Why should that be more reason to pay the person to pay the employee? It doesn't make sense logically. So he says, what's the Mordechai talking about? Then he must be talking about a different scenario. Fascinating idea here. The Tavo Shalom Mordechai, Sham, the Chayv Malamed. So why a malamed must be different? The Chayv Malamed Gzeres HaMoshel, nearest the Sphirle, Kevan de Malamed, Asur Lito Schar Limud, Rak Schar Shimur, Kmevar Ben Darim, Ugzeres HaMoshel, Eno Ones, Ala Shimur, Rak Ala Limud, Lukach Chayv Ba'abayis, Kevan, Shalonaza Ones, Al Davar Shes Sachro. So, for background, there's this idea in halacha of mani bechinam af ata bechinam, that generally one shouldn't be paid money to study Torah or to teach Torah, and so then how does one pay all the rebbeim in all the schools, or a malamed in this case? So the halachic reason that's given is that you're not paying the teacher of Torah to teach Torah. You're paying them to be a shomer, you're paying them to be a babysitter. And okay, if they teach them Torah on the side, that's a free bonus. Right? So that's sort of a workaround for how it's permitted to pay Torah teachers. So here too, the Melamed, when he gets paid, classically, the classic Melamed gets paid. Why is he getting paid? Not for teaching Torah, but for babysitting. And what was made illegal in this town? They didn't make babysitting illegal. What they made illegal was teaching Torah. But the Rabbi says, I'm happy to continue babysitting your child. The Melamed is happy to continue babysitting. You probably don't want that. You'd rather have someone else babysit your children. The Melameds for teaching Torah and have them just hang out. It's not what you want. But too bad. You signed up. You hired him. The official, the theoretical official contract, the agreement was for the Melamed to babysit, and he's willing to babysit, so you have to continue paying. But that Mordechai doesn't reflect more broadly on anything in our realm, anything about workers in general. It's a specific case there. So that's the Nesivos' objection there. Now the Shach quotes the Maram Padua, who says, "Mashma the dafka kishamuat barchu, avon davar chazak shekulam barchu havi makas medina." So the part of the factor here is defining exactly how makas medina works. So the Shach says this whole application of this ruling, it depends if everyone leaves or only some people leave. And he says that right, and we seem to posit that as long as the majority of people leave the area, that counts as makas medina, and one would apply the halacha accordingly. Which again, as we saw, for the Ramah means that the employee does get paid, whereas we saw for the Nesivos, it means he does not get paid, right? So opposite, or for the Nesivos, it's no different than the normal case of onus. But both the Shach and the Taz here, someone who's renting a house, he compares that to our case. And he gives some reasons as why this is makas medina. Fine. Right, he says, if the majority of people need to run away because of health reasons or the like, that's makas medina. Now the Sma, another commentator on Shulchan Aruch, disagrees with the Ramah as well, and he writes, we until now we've been assuming that even though in the normal case your Melamed, your employee gets sick, they don't get paid. If there's a makas medina, if there's a pandemic, they would get paid. We've been assuming they get paid in full. But he says that's not what the Mordechai means. You don't get paid in full. Why should you get paid in full? Neither side could have predicted it. Under normal circumstances, that would mean the Melamed doesn't get paid at all. So that seems unusual that we now say, because it's global, because the ruler says no one can teach Torah, that you don't get paid at all. So what about the Mordechai, citing the Marami Rittenberg? What he said, what we saw, makas medina and the Ramah quotes the Marami Rittenberg and the Mordechai that the normal rule applies, that which we understood to mean that the employee gets paid if it's a pandemic. He's following his own logic. But this is wrong. There's no basis for this. So what's the conclusion? Adarabba, Mistaver Lomar came to Makas Medina, he Hamaski Vasoker Shavin Badavar. They should be equal, they're both equally affected, just like we saw before in terms of renting spaces, the same thing by employees. Since the whole world, everyone, employers and employees, are equally affected by Makas Medina, by a pandemic or a global problem, they should split the loss. The Ein Lamar de Maslo, the Shum Echad Garam. It's no one particular person's fault, it's everyone's fault, so they should split the losses equally. And therefore we should conclude one of two things. Either whoever's holding on to the money, if you didn't pay yet, you don't need to pay. If you already paid, you don't get it back. Possession is 9/10 of the law. Oh, the fachos, yeah, have said al shnei, or maybe they should both lose. They should split the loss. So we have, if you think about it, we have four different positions here. The Ramah, straightforward reading of the Ramah, and the Shach and Taz seems to be that you do need to pay employees in a pandemic. Then Nesibo says that's only true for a malamed because of unique circumstances, but usually you don't pay employees during a pandemic. And the SMA here has two middle positions. Either you pay them half, or hamotzi michaver el. It depends if you paid already or not. So there's a wide range of views on this issue. If we look at the Minchas Asher, again, Rav Asher Weiss, how do we paskin? Ve'ol eladina mikol anal. Again, he goes through the sugya in great length. What's the definition of makas medina here? If most people in your field stop working, so most schools shut down. The loss in a pandemic, in a makas medina, the loss falls on the employer, meaning they have to pay the employees despite not having school and presumably getting, not getting tuition or getting less tuition. You get full pay. The Nesivos, as we saw, says no. Even the Ramah doesn't mean what he sounds like he means. Really, you do have to pay. You still don't pay the Malamed. The Sma says they split. So what do? You have three different views. You have such a wide range of views, it's not even clear what the halacha is. So this is a good reason to not do pure halacha, but rather to do yachloku, to split, to do pshara and yachloku. So the pshara, as was mentioned before, pshara is not pure din. It's not the pure letter of the law. It's using a sense of equity in the overall sense of the circumstance, and you don't necessarily, figure out which shita you paskin. Like, you use the halacha as a general framework, and then you look at the situation and you apply the two together and figure out how exactly to rule. So that's the Minchas Asher there. And in fact, the Minchas Asher and many cite an important passage from the Chassam Sofer. This is in, I guess it's like autobiographical reflections in a Sefer Zikaron. Here's the frontispiece, the first page, and here's page Lamed Zayin. He's talking about, I believe, during the Franco-Austrian War, but he says, and he talks about the terrible things that that the Jews were subjected to, including at one point, again, not being allowed to teach. For whatever reason, the schools were closed down for an extended period of time. What do you do about that time when you couldn't be in school, you couldn't be learning in yeshiva? Im yischayvu schar mishalem olo. Do they pay in full? Do you need to pay full tuition to the malamed or not? Dani be'ani amarti din Torah lo yadati. I, in my poverty, who am I? I'm just a Chassam Sofer. I don't know what the halacha is. So what did he do? V'ani mishalim l'schirim sheli schar mishalem bli nikui klal. I paid my own employees full money. I don't know what the halacha is. I want to do the right thing. Play it safe. So play it safe means paying the full money to my employees. I think in this case, teachers or yeshiva employees or malamdim, but it sounds like it wouldn't be any different for other sorts of employees. The atem, for you, I'm not going to impose that stringency on you. You, the community, tivatzu hadin al pi hefsher l'shalim chetzio v'yafsin malamid chetzio. So you should do pshara. You should do not letter of the law, figure out exactly what the halacha is and do according to that. You should do pshara, and that'll come out that each side loses half, meaning you pay the malamed half the usual wages, and each side, one side gets half their usual salary, the malamed. The people pay for not getting service. Each side loses half, and that's how you split the losses. And he says, fine. He quotes some of the positions here, quotes the Sma and others. But the point is, he obviously knows the sugya, but he's saying it's a complicated sugya. It's not clear how to rule. Better to do pshara. And of course, it's not just that it's complicated. In general, there's a tendency. Many posts can prefer pshara. Some batei din only do pshara. They won't rule on the pure halacha. It's sort of it gives a little wiggle room where necessary. And especially in a case like this, where it's not like someone's in the right and someone's in the wrong, and you need to figure that out. Here, really, everyone, no one did anything wrong. It's we're in a crisis, something terrible has happened. So the equitable thing is to split the loss. It's sort of a different sense of justice. One might say, he doesn't use these words, but conceptually, one might think there's different types of justice. There's retributive justice. If you do something wrong, you get punished. If you steal money, you pay it back. And that's, often many areas things work like that, right? If you pull out of a deal, you get penalized. That's retributive justice. This is distributive justice. We have money, or in this case, losses. We have difficulties and challenges. And distributive justice is the question of how to distribute those losses so that you're minimizing the overall pain and the overall loss for the whole community. So here, the Chassam Sofer encouraged this, and many others have followed, to emphasize pshara. So, if you say, okay, you get paid in full and you get nothing, that might be too much of a hardship for one side. If you say, but if you say to each split the loss, hopefully each side will be able to manage. And again, pshara will also depend on the capacity of each side to sustain the loss. We'll see this more going forward. I'll just mention, I saw it noted, I hadn't heard this previously, but Rabbi Zuckier in an article mentioned that just like the Chassam Sofer continued paying his employees in this Makas Medina, in a parallel scenario, where during the Intifada, where the Arab workers weren't allowed into Yeshivat Har Etzion, to the Gush, to be able to work, Rav Aaron Lichtenstein also said that they should be paid in full, because again, it's no one, well, it's not their fault, they can't come into work, so they should be paid in full. So those are some of the overall categories here. There's some additional details that are worth mentioning just quickly. We mentioned already Paul Batel, and here's source 21 is the Taz, which says Hainu Chatzi Aschiris. Paul Batel usually is about 50%. Whatever you get paid, usually the fact that you don't need to do the labor associated with it, you should get 50%. The Ramah here mentions, and this is complicated, that in some cases getting paid versus not getting paid makes a difference. We saw that already in other contexts. We're not going to go through that inside. And right, the Trumas Adeshen, also a similar idea to what we saw before in the Machane Ephraim, that sometimes if you paid already, that indicates that you don't want, you're okay with the deal and you wouldn't pull out. One last thing, well, there's a few general points that are relevant before we jumped into recent statements. So a few more things. So Dina de Malchusa Dina. So if one decides to go to secular courts, which Jewish law generally prefers going to Jewish courts, but if for whatever reason a case is adjudicated in secular courts, that would be binding, and you wouldn't be able to sort of double dip, right? If you say, oh, you cancel the contract, I'll get, I'll sue you in secular court and I'll sue you in Jewish court. Obviously, you can't double dip like that. Also, these factors need to be, you need to calculate other relevant factors, meaning if someone, let's say, is laid off from, let's say, a teaching job because school's not in session and they get unemployment, so that should be factored in too, right? If they end up getting half of their usual salary through unemployment, you're obviously not going to pay them their full salary. You're probably not even going to pay them half their salary because they're already being compensated. So when you're dividing the loss, so to speak, it'll come out differently. Other factors, contracts. If there's a contract, you generally enforce the contract. This is a principle in halacha, although there's a limit on that. Source 24 here talks about an idea called asmachta. Asmachta means if you contract for something that you don't actually believe, it's not serious, it's not a real contract, and it's not binding. So if I say to you, the case here is, I owe you $100, and we reach the deadline, and I don't have it, I say, okay, if I don't have, I'll pay you back $100 by next week, and if I don't have it by next week, I'll owe you $200. We assume that a person who says that doesn't really mean it. They're just saying that to get out of a tough spot, and that doesn't work halachically. So contracts will work assuming that they actually correspond to something real. Meaning, if you say, okay, you're renting the hall, if you cancel, less than a month in advance, you have to pay 30% of the fee. Why 30%? Because 30% is, the work that we put in advance correlates to 30% or whatever it is. If you say you pay 100%, if you cancel a month before, you have to pay 100%. That doesn't actually correlate to, and presumably they can find other people in a normal scenario. That wouldn't correlate to anything real. That would just be an asmachta. That would just be a way of, of threatening, of sort of forcing someone's hand. And presumably when you commit to that, you don't mean it and it wouldn't work. So generally contracts work, except where it seems like, the parties didn't actually mean it. So that's another relevant factor. Yet another factor here is minhag hamedina. When there are certain fields where everyone in the field works a certain way. The expectation is you always, whatever it is, if let's say theoretically there was a clear expectation about pulling out of rental agreements and how that worked, and everyone knew that when they signed up for the rental agreement, that would also be binding. Fine. And one last thing is, let's say you sign up for a Pesach program and the Pesach program was canceled. So on the one hand, let's say they cancel it, it's their fault that they canceled it. On the one hand, you'd expect to get all your money back. On the other hand, especially if they're not at fault, especially if there's some onus involved, maybe something they could have foreseen and not you, there's generally a principle that expenses already rendered, if they already spent money on organizing the program or buying food or whatever, within reason, those you wouldn't get that but money back as well. So those are some general principles applicable here. Let's jump in to some of the sources that recently came out. So here, from just over a month ago, the Lakewood Beis Havad, which is sort of the organization that rules on all sorts of practical Halakhic cases, and reviewed by Roy Forsheimer, one of the senior poskim in Lakewood, they came up with guidelines for playgroup. So they said, they comply with Halakhic guidelines, and they said it's not really absolutely binding. This is general guidelines, not a ruling for either party. You'll work it out later. But this is actually a very skillfully done, very strong set of guidelines here, both halakhically and practically, certainly as far as I can tell. So, right, they say places that force to close. The parent's obligation, you have to pay tuition for the days it's closed. Whether you have to pay tuition is subject to a great debate among earlier poskim. And we saw this debate. Some poskim require the parents to pay the full tuition for the time the playgroups are closed, while others completely exempt the parents from tuition. Other poskim require the parents to pay half the tuition. And we saw that just minutes ago. If you look in the footnote here, they talk about the normal case of when one has onus and can't work, and how usually you don't pay the worker, but it might be different if it's Makas Medina. They quote the Mordechai and the Ramah. That sounds like then you do have to pay the teacher or the employee, but they also quote the Achronim there who disagree with him, and they quote some of the positions that we saw that you either don't pay or you only need to pay half. So that's one relevant factor. So they say, being that there is no clear halachic consensus, the parents cannot be forced to make further payments. So the logic there, again, is hamotzi mechaver alav araya, both because it's unclear halachically, and if you haven't made the payment yet, you can't be forced to make a payment on that basis. So therefore, they say, and this is not obvious, this is a little controversial, accordingly, moras should not cash any head checks they may have, right? A pre-dated check, they shouldn't cash them, and parents have the right to cancel the check. Now you might say, yes, parents have the right to cancel the check, but you still shouldn't cancel it. But that's not the logic they went with. They want to return all the checks, fine. Although strict halacha generally dictates that a party cannot be required to pay out of pocket in a manner of doubt, nevertheless, a pshara, a compromise, is recommended. So they say, they end up ruling, because there's so much machlokas, there's such dispute, unclear, it's not clear what the halacha is, you don't need it, no money should really exchange hands in a new way. I shouldn't have to pay money I haven't already paid. But that's din, that's the technical halacha. But pshara, this idea of compromise and thinking about equity more generally would dictate that people should pay something. And they quote the Chassam Sofer that we saw, and they say in our situation, the pshara must be reduced to reflect the ease of work that the Mora has from the playgroup closure, right? This is schar batala. It's a lot easier to spend your day not running around after little kids than it is to spend your day running around after little kids. And if you didn't know that before coronavirus, and you have little kids that you've had a chance to interact with, you definitely know it now. So, and the ads, of course, the actual pshara amount can be adjusted based on other relevant factors, such as the parents and the Mora's relative financial situation, the Mora's ability to receive unemployment benefits or other such assistance. This is the general idea of equity, thinking about the overall situation, both the halacha, which in this case is not so clear, and there may be a bias towards the muhsad, the person holding on to the money, but also to consider what the Mora is getting otherwise and what the capacity of the two sides are. Now they give some specifics. March tuition, keep the full payment, because most of March there was school anyway, or groups anyway, or play groups anyway. What about going forward? Parents should pay between a quarter and a third of the regular monthly tuition payment. And that incorporates a discount for March, whatever. We're not going to go into the details, but the logic here, why a quarter or a third? So the logic is as follows. It's in the footnote, but we're not going to go down to it. As we saw, there's different views whether you need to pay or not. So if you need to pay everything, you need to pay nothing, you need to pay half. So you average that out, you need to pay half. That's the halacha, the halakhic average. Add to that schar batala, that it's easier to be a mora who's not working than a mora who is working, and that decreases it again further from a half to either a quarter or a third, right? Because if you say schar batala is a half, as we saw in the Taz, a half of a half is a quarter. Some people think schar batala should really be 2/3, then you decrease it to a third. So something in that range. And finally, they talk about going forward, how much they charge, daily payment. But that's the that's the general story here. And then jumping to the end, the pshara is intended to be mutual, meaning the mora is waiving the right to further payment, right? You can't take your third or quarter payment and then sue for more later. That presumably would be the basis of the pshara, of the compromise in the first place. So very, very well thought out guidelines. I actually asked my sister, who has a child in playgroup in Lakewood, and her sense was, among her friends, this is very well received, and people are very nervous to start with. What do you do? It's very difficult. You're going to be expected to pay everything. You feel bad if you don't, and having a communal standard is often very helpful, right? There's I guess a meta question here. Aside from the technical halacha, and just a heads up, I expect we'll go another 10 or maybe 15 minutes just because we started a bit late and had some technical pauses. So there's so there's sort of a broader communal question, which is, do you deal with things retail or wholesale? Do you say, we're going to give one psak for the whole community? Or do you say, we're going to deal with every case on an issue-by-issue basis? So Lakewood has general guidelines. They say this is not the absolute halacha. These are guidelines and not absolutely binding. So they're going, they're a bit in the middle, but towards the side of having communal guidelines, which, as I said, my sense is that they've been very well received. They have a second letter they came out with a few days ago where they go into more detail about if the mora is receiving unemployment, then obviously you take that into account. And presumably the unemployment will be more than the third or quarter. So probably if the mora is getting unemployment, you wouldn't end up paying much. And here's another relevant thing. Many playgroup moras are providing conference calls and other services for their students. So some, right? Some, just like schools are doing online learning or over the phone learning, more likely in Lakewood. But some playgroups are also doing some online learning. So if you choose to be involved, there should be some payment for the services. And it's of course not going to be full payment, but maybe you'd instead of paying a quarter to a third, you'd pay 40 to 50% of the regular money because they spend an hour with your kids. They're going through the details of how this would practically play out, very detailed, very considerate and concerned for the well-being of the community. Here's fascinating. Even if the parents sign a contract with language about paying tuition in the event of cancellation, such clauses would not govern this unique situation. Why not? So this is asmachta. Nobody expects a pandemic. So when you signed your clause saying, oh, if the student can't come for whatever reason, we still will pay, you weren't thinking of this scenario, and therefore you don't need, you wouldn't be obligated to pay, although maybe it's still relevant. Some language may apply. You have to look on a case-by-case basis. Yeah, and fine, and the mora might decline to accept the payment, and they can say, they can, if the moras say, well, a third is not enough, they can say, we don't want your kid in our play group going forward. They're going through these factors here. That's Lakewood's guidance. Baltimore, the Vat of Baltimore, sort of in the Ner Yisrael orbit, gave other guidelines. Their guidelines spoke not only about groups, but also about schools, where they say Rabbeim and moras should be paid in full, based on the Ramah and post-Shulchan Aruch. And interestingly, the classic case of the Melamed is parallel here, although there's no government dictate against the teaching, but it's sort of a parallel case in some ways. And they say you should still be paid. That's their psak there, and the Chassam Sofer suggested that they get paid. Of course, this is not just the logic here is somewhat interesting, because they say because the teachers are being paid by the school, therefore parents should pay full tuition to the school if possible, right? So that's an interest, right? Tuition must therefore continue to be paid to the schools because they're going to continue to pay their faculty. Now, these two are not necessarily linked on a halakhic level, right? If the school has certain obligations to the faculty, that's not the same as the obligation of a student to the school. You could make an argument that those would be distinct. I think part of the goal here, this is a takana, a sort of a communal enactment to try to make sure to help keep the institutions afloat. If the Rabbeim don't get paid, that would be terrible. They would be in very dire financial situation. If the school doesn't get paid, that would shut down the school. So the goal here, at least for families who can pay, they talk about tuition breaks and people who have difficulty, but at least for those who can pay, to expect people to pay. They also say even playgroup moras who are doing some programming should be paid in full, rather than Lakewood was saying 40 or 50%, they're saying pay in full. And then they have some technical ideas here. Babysitters and paid carpool drivers should get, and playgroup assistants should get, should get half pay, right? If you're not doing additional programming, you should get half pay. So it's interesting to note that the numbers here are a bit higher than the Lakewood numbers, right? Lakewood was looking at a third to a quarter to a third without programming and a half about with programming. And here it's more like a half without programming and full with programming. So I think there's two factors here. One is the Lakewood psak was sort of stacking the two factors of it's not clear if you need to pay at all, so pay half, and schar batala, so half of half is a quarter. Whereas here they're not really stacking, they're just doing, I'm not sure either, I assume it's probably the schar batala. Schar batala knocks you down to half. If you're doing online teaching, that brings you back to full, but they're not including the idea that some poskim say you shouldn't pay or you should only pay half. They're not incorporating that. On a practical level, one might argue that there's also a sociological difference because, and this is speculation, but Lakewood is a much younger community. The average age of a parent is much, or average age of overall is much younger. People who are less established financially, whereas Baltimore is, on average a bit older, more established. Maybe they assume that there's more financial capacity on the part of parents in Baltimore rather than Lakewood, which of course, if we're working on the basis of Pshara here, which people have noted, that's very important, right? The capacity of people to pay is one of the main factors when thinking about Pshara, about how to evaluate. When we're not trying to find fault, we're trying to figure out the best way forward. There also was guidelines about playgroups from the 5 towns. We're not going to go through that, but they suggest also a 50-50 split. I would say certainly, there's also probably, I would guess there's more capacity in the 5 towns as opposed to Lakewood as well, which may be part of it. But there's not too much new here that aren't in the other sources. Now, on a somewhat different note, Rav Herschel Schechter of YU has a letter not focusing on schools, focusing for our purposes relevant to Pesach programs. We'll read the English for reasons of time, but maybe the important thing is if you look, the title is Utstaka Tatzil Mimaves, right? Tzedakah saves from death. Tzedakah has important abilities, and this piece was written on Yud Daled Nisan, Erev Pesach, right before Pesach. People were thinking about what do we do about Yizkor? What do you do about Yizkor? Usually do Yizkor on Yantif. You're not having services on Yantif because the shuls are closed. So what do we do about Yizkor? So Schechter starts off, if you're unable to gather in shul, Yizkor may be recited without a minyan, but the main point of Yizkor, and this is not well known, not as well known as it should be, is to serve as a context in which to pledge to tzedakah in the merit of deceased loved ones. That's the real idea of Yizkor. That's the origin of the minhag. You make a commitment to tzedakah, and then around that you say Yizkor, you hope Hashem remembers your relative and helps them, etc. The Rambam says the main idea of Simchas Yom Tov is about giving to tzedakah, and he says this is even more critical at the present. Tanakh teaches tzedakah is one way to bring salvation from death. So both tzedakah is more necessary, but also the salvific powers of tzedakah are more relevant. And he says, and here we go from pure halacha to a little bit of musar, a little bit of ethical exhortation. In particular, those who are willing to spend thousands of dollars in order to celebrate Pesach in hotels with their families should certainly donate the money which they did not ultimately spend to charity. Right, so if you're going to be spending whatever it is, several $1,000s a person for a Pesach program, and in the end you can't and it gets canceled, so you should give the money to people who actually who need it. You're not spending, you're staying home, it's much cheaper. You should spend the money for people who need it. And now he gets into some of the details of Pesach programs. The current crisis presents many issues of Jewish civil law and conflicts between parties, issues of payments and refunds, and we saw several of those today. There will be many factors for a bezin to evaluate. In general, proprietors of Pesach programs are paid both for the experience and goods they provide and for their own expenses invested in preparing the program, right? So it's not like ordering a pizza. When you order a pizza, you're paying for the pizza. You're not really paying for anything else, for the work. For a program, a large-scale thing like a Pesach program, you're paying for your experience, which you're not getting this year, but you're also paying for all the preparation that needs to go into it. When the program is canceled due to events outside their control, as in this situation, a bezin will have to assess how much of the money should be refunded and how much is justifiably kept to cover their own losses and to compensate them for the efforts already expended. So there's already a question mark. You're not going to get back all your money in this case because some of the payment towards a Pesach program is the year-long employees who do the planning, things that were already ordered. Maybe if they can't get back their reservation fee from the hotel, you won't get that money back if that's a cost already taken out by the program. A bezin will also factor in how much financial aid will be provided by the government or from insurers when calculating the reimbursement, among other considerations. Right? Obviously, if the hotel or if the Pesach program is going to it has insurance and is going to get fully paid, so they should pay you back all your money too, right? If they're not going to end up losing anything. Fine. So that's some of the halakhic considerations. But now again, to the moral exhortation to the musar, even if the letter of the law demands the proprietors do refund large sums of money, which likely would be the case, right? Presumably the main thing you're paying for in a Pesach program is the hotel room, the food. That should be a good, I don't know, 70, 80%. So maybe a small chunk you'd save. The hotel wouldn't have to pay on din, on technical halacha, letter of the law. The program participants should keep in mind that the Jewish people are identified by mercy and compassion, are commanded to go above and beyond and being sensitive to the needs and struggles of others. Sometimes it's appropriate to demonstrate this mercy by forgiving a debt when it's clear the debtor is struggling financially. As opposed to going to Beis Din to demand the full amount, one should request of the Beis Din to make a just pshara, to make a fair compromise, not compromise in the usual sense, like 50-50, but that the resolution should be determined based on each scenario, considering all the factors, thinking about equity, thinking about what's fair in this situation. So essentially, the logic would be like this. If the proprietor of the Pesach program is going to go bankrupt and have ruinous personal loss, so maybe you shouldn't try to squeeze every dollar out of him. You should go for pshara, and there should be some global resolution to allow for no one to really suffer too much. And of course, part of the logic here, sort of as was stated, is that if you're going to a Pesach program, you have this money that in the end you didn't spend. You have a large chunk of the money you would have spent on the Pesach program. It's not like you spent that much on making Pesach at home. So that money is, in a sense, it's now available to help support those who may be in a crisis, such as the proprietor of the program or other people, or tzedakah more generally. And of course, that's why this was framed as in the context of tzedakah and yizkor. Regarding payments made to yeshivos and day schools, some parents have demanded refunds. And he says this is certainly an improper approach. The schools and yeshivos already cannot pay the salaries of the Raymond teachers. If we ask for reimbursements and remove our support, the schools will shut down due to the current and impending financial challenges. So again, this is not din. He's not saying halakhically you're not entitled to a refund. Maybe you are technically, but it's an improper approach. It's not an idea of pshara or the fnei mishuras din, going above and beyond. If you can afford to pay tuition, so yes, you are getting fewer services from the school this year, even if they're doing online learning or whatever it is, but squeezing the money out of the school if you have the capacity to pay, right? I assume if someone loses their job, it's a different story. But if one has the same capacity, but says, well, I'm not getting the service, I'm not going to pay, that's an improper approach. Rather, we must do our part to support the schools and yeshivos to the best of our abilities in order to ensure they'll be available to serve our communities when the epidemic comes to an end. Doing so would be considered tzedakah, he notes, for all purposes and represent the attitude that our tradition demands. And I think, if I recall, in the Hebrew, and maybe one of the other sources, maybe the Lakewood source as well, said that some of this money that you end up paying, you can pay as your meiser money. It can be counted as tzedakah money out of your meiser, because if you don't owe it on a technical halachic grounds, you're paying it because you're choosing to do pshara. You're choosing to pay more than technically you have to be, to do the ethical thing. You can count that towards your tzedakah. So this is, several cases, both Pesach programs and schools, but thinking about those who are being challenged, who have challenges due to coronavirus, whether a proprietor of a program that got sunk, or whether schools that are facing major challenges, that those who have the capacity to pitch in more, such as those attending Pesach programs, such as those who could have paid tuition and their financial situation hasn't changed, the assumption is that they should do everything they can going forward. And again, this is based on pshara. As much as there's din, there's all these sources that we saw before. At the end of the day, that is a factor, but these other factors of your capacity to pay and what's needed are relevant as well. One final source from the Rabbinical Council of Bergen County, a bit over a month ago. What about people, babysitters or help in the homes? So they sent out a longer letter that I cut this piece out of. People who have cleaning or babysitting help in your homes should try to maintain their salaries since they rely on this income, right? If someone, they're living paycheck to paycheck based on work they're doing in people's homes, now that work is dried up. So what should happen? They should be evicted from their homes. They should go hungry. You should continue paying them. And it says should. It's not saying this is a halachic obligation. They don't go into the halacha. They're working on the basis of pshara and doing what's right. Additionally, if these employees should not be coming to our homes at this time, they should not be coming to the homes, especially they work in multiple houses throughout the week, right? Meaning to say, okay, I'm paying them, they might as well come. Well, that's dangerous, and the RCVC has been very proactive and very successful in emphasizing the dangers and how people should try to minimize the human interaction that would be dangerous. So you certainly shouldn't have them working for you, but you also if you can, should continue paying their salaries because they really rely on the income. And again, this is not din. It's not argued on the basis of din. It's argued on the basis of lifnei mishuras din, going beyond what's expected, and shara, and doing the right thing. So just to sum up, as we saw, both in the area of renting spaces and the area of renting workers or hiring workers, employees, there's a wide range of views as to whether Makas Medina, whether the fact that there's a pandemic, that there's a global challenge, changes things and means that the employee should get paid despite not working, or that one should be exempt from paying from the space, even though usually one might be. There's a wide range of views, from everything to nothing to half to it depends on who's holding on to the money. In practice, most poskim have advised pshara, which means not necessarily to go based on the letter of the law, which itself is not clear, but to try as much as possible to continue supporting as many people and as many communities as we can, to try to do the best we can as a community to overcome this challenge. And that means distributive justice, where the brunt of this financial challenge is borne by those who can carry it the most. And hopefully, God willing, this will be in the schus of our tzedakah and our giving to the right causes unselfishly. This will lead to both our community being able to overcome the financial challenges and also the physical, biological, and all the other challenges that come in the wake of coronavirus. We have a minute or two for questions, if people have them. I'm seeing on Facebook, someone writes, what are the parameters of Medina? Does it have to be global or national or any local, state, city? So Rav Asher Weiss deals with this issue. His opinion, which seems to make a lot of sense, is that it means basically the area, the general region, which based on the Mishnah is reasonable. The Mishnah talks about flood in an area, so that it's the geographic area that relies on the river. If there's a flood, or if the river doesn't work, whatever it is that affects the fields, it depends on essentially that market or that area. The way that applies nowadays is, it depends on the market. So Rav Asher Weiss says this shchuna, this neighborhood of Yerushalayim, where there's whatever it is, a few hundred apartments that are overwhelmingly rented by Americans, that qualifies as its own Medina, so to speak. So the fact that that market is affected adversely by coronavirus, even though their neighbors, the people, the next shchuna, the next neighborhood over, are all, native Israelis and are staying there, and there's no issue. The fact that this particular area is affected makes it Makas Medina. So that would be the standard. That would be the standard for Medina. So that was a question on Facebook Live. Other questions? Okay, if there are no further questions, everyone, as we said, this should be a schus for all of us. We should all, be as successful as possible, both in contributing where we can and in overcoming these challenges as a community.
Thank you very much.